Resident Evil 7, Call of Duty World War II, Doom. These are just a handful of games in recent years that have made a conscious effort to go back to their roots, with RE7 refocusing itself as a survival horror experience, the genre it popularized, COD World War II going back to the setting where it all began and once again featuring classic boots-on-the-ground gameplay, and Doom, a game that literally scrapped years worth of development, opting instead to restart from the ground up as a game that went back to its roots that Marty Stratton, executive producer at id Software, described as a game about killing demons, big effing guns, and moving really fast. But is this a good thing? Is it good for a game to try and recapture the magic of experiences that came before, to maintain aspects that are tried and true, or does it potentially risk making the game feel stale and hinder it from trying new things? Well, let's consider the latter for a moment. Oftentimes, the oppositional argument to a series returning to its roots is that games need to evolve. Games can't get complacent and do the same things over and over again, or else people will get tired of it. Who wants to buy a game that's just like the one that came before? We need new things. And I actually believe that's true. A game does need to offer new experiences, that's important, but it's a false narrative to assume that a game that is returning to its roots can't accomplish this. As someone who has covered both Halo and Call of Duty fan bases that have both called for their respective franchises to return to their roots, I can say firsthand that never try anything new, only do what has been done before, is not what they mean. It's not about doing the same thing over and over again. It's about identifying what principles are important to your game and maintaining them. When communities call for a franchise to go back, it typically means that something has been lost. The experience that players once associated with a particular series is no longer provided by that series. The problem isn't that changes were made in general. The problem is that those additions or alterations changed what some would consider core, identifying principles of the game in question. The genetic makeup of a title, if you will. A formula or system or gameplay loop that produces a feeling or emotion that individuals associate with a particular franchise. The traits that are responsible for that feeling, those are your roots. When you change them or stray from them, for a lot of players, it can literally feel like it isn't even the same game anymore. And remember, we agree that a sequel should offer new experiences, but shouldn't a sequel also maintain the essence of what came before? Shouldn't that feeling and sense of identity present in a prior title be present in future titles? And to me, that's where the answer for this argument lies. You can do new things, but they should be built around your roots and complement them. When alterations contradict the core formula, that's when players feel the series is strayed away and stopped providing what it once did. So in this light, I think going back to your roots can be a good thing for a franchise to do, to maintain what is important to the identity of your game and build compelling things around it. Sounds simple, but it isn't that easy. There's still a lot of problems and misconceptions that we need to address. The first misconception is that going back to your roots automatically makes your game good. It doesn't. Just because you have that core of your game intact doesn't automatically make all of the ideas and scenarios you put around it good. And this is a situation that I saw frequently in the comments section of my recent Call of Duty review. World War II returned to its original setting and brought back the boots-on-the-ground gameplay fans have been asking for, and despite that, I found the game to be relatively uninspired and mediocre. I cannot count the amount of comments I got saying, wow, all of you guys asked for boots on the ground, and then when you got exactly what you wanted, you didn't even like it. That's because the game didn't do anything interesting with it. It didn't take that formula and surround it with compelling ideas. It was content to just be average. And that inevitably leads to another misconception where when this happens, and a game that goes back to its roots isn't received as highly as the games that came before it, you hear, it's outdated. That type of game just won't work in today's market. People have moved on. They gave people what they wanted and they still didn't like it. It must be old. No. That's not true either. Let me give you an example from another game in another genre where a similar argument was used. In early 2017, Yooka-Laylee was released. Now, despite being a new IP, it was in essence a spiritual successor to Banjo-Kazooie. It was even made by some of the same team. You could say it tried to go back to the roots of its genre, a genre that has become far less prominent and one that many felt was outdated. It wasn't received very well. People didn't like it all that much. It wasn't a good game, and because of that, you heard the same argument I mentioned a few moments ago. It's outdated, the formula's old, you only think it's good because of nostalgia, yada yada yada. That's not true though. Yooka-Laylee wasn't bad because its formula was bad or its genre was outdated. It was bad because, once again, the game surrounding it just wasn't very fun. It had poor execution. The ways in which the game had you utilize that core wasn't compelling. Yooka-Laylee isn't automatically good just because it's a 3D platformer. It has to be a good 3D platformer. And if you need proof of what I'm talking about, look no further than to Super Mario Odyssey. It's in the same genre, builds off of a formula that was introduced back in 1996, and it's a smash hit. It's one of the most inventive video games ever made. It was nominated for Game of the Year. It sold a boatload of copies. It has that core 3D platforming collectathon formula, but it built a wonderful and compelling game around it. And it wasn't the only platformer platformer released this year to achieve praise. While overshadowed significantly by Odyssey, we also saw A Hat in Time officially get released this year. Like Yooka-Laylee, it's a game that was made to try and emulate a classic 3D platformer. But unlike Yooka-Laylee, it was actually pretty well received. It had that core, but it had the ideas around it to back it up. It's a great little indie game. And all of these examples just go to show you that just because a game goes back to its roots doesn't automatically make it good. But if it turns out to be subpar, that doesn't necessarily mean its roots are bad either. And that leads to the next problem. Because not all games have the same roots, it can be hard to identify them. Just because a concept or feature may be important to one game doesn't necessarily make it important for another. Or just because an addition may fit well with a particular formula doesn't mean it won't damage another. And I'll use an example of a game I've covered a lot, Halo. When Halo adds new gameplay mechanics to the player, it has a huge impact on the game around it. I've argued that features like sprint, climbing, enhanced mobility, all of these things alter Halo's core and that the series would be better off innovating through the sandbox and environments instead. Well, oftentimes you'll hear Call of Duty added sprinting and everyone liked it. This game added the same thing Halo added and it was well received. Well, that's because every game is different. Every game has its own roots and concepts that are important to them. Just because it works for one franchise doesn't mean it'll work for all of them. Halo is very sensitive to change. Its formula is balanced on a very delicate fulcrum where even the smallest additions can have a huge impact on the experience. But then you take a game like Titanfall 2, where it added things like power sliding and grappling hooks. These open up your mobility options tremendously, and yet the core of Titanfall is still completely intact, because those abilities complemented Titanfall's formula and enhanced it. Now look at a game like Doom. It's going back to the roots of a game that literally didn't even let you aim on the Y-axis, and yet despite all of its modern conventions, it still feels like Doom. You move fast, you use big effing guns, and you kill demons. But then you look at a game like Resident Evil 7. When you compare it to the original, a lot has changed. It literally changed its entire perspective from fixed camera angles to first person, and yet despite all of the changes that brings, it still feels like a Resident Evil game. In fact, it's arguably the closest the series has been to the original Resident Evil in over a decade, because the perspective wasn't important. RE7 brought back the survival horror aspects. It brought back managing your resources. It brought back the intimate environments that expand and open up more as you progress. The perspective may have changed, but the roots are there. And that goes to illustrate my point that not all games have the same roots. I mean, how many franchises could completely change their perspective and still provide the same core experience? Not many. And while we're talking about Resident Evil, I think there's another really important lesson to take from this franchise, because Resident Evil 7 wasn't the first shift in perspective this series has had. Resident Evil 4 marked a monumental shift in the series. It's a very peculiar case where a game seemingly changed its core formula and still managed to be wildly successful. In fact, it's often considered to be one of the greatest games ever made. It's a bit of an anomaly when it comes to what we've talked about, but there is one important distinction that might help explain this. Resident Evil 4 changed to be different. It separated itself from the other survival horror franchises of the time and arguably became more unique. It popularized the over-the-shoulder camera angle, and it inspired nearly every third-person shooter that came after it. So often nowadays, we see games stray from their roots in order to emulate something else, to be more like something that already exists. But RE4 did the opposite. And so oftentimes the games that fans want to return to their roots are games that adopted traits from something that is already out there, and that's a problem. I think the ultimate goal is for a game to provide something unique, to provide an experience that no other title can give you. That's the feeling we talked about. A cry for a return to one's roots is often a cry to get that unique feeling back. And even though Resident Evil 4 certainly strayed away from its roots in some aspects, it did so to literally innovate and inspire the entire genre. And note, as its sequels became even more and more action-focused, when they started to try and copy and emulate the more action-oriented experiences available, culminating in the absolutely ridiculous Resident Evil 6, the fans received it poorly, and what did they ask for? A return to the series' survival horror roots, which is exactly what Resident Evil 7 did, featuring an even more intimate perspective than before. But just because Resident Evil can shift its perspective doesn't mean Titanfall could. And just because Titanfall can add sliding and grappling hooks doesn't mean Halo should. Just because Halo maybe shouldn't add new base mechanics doesn't mean Doom can't, and so on and so forth. Every game is different, and every game has different things that are important to them, and sometimes you don't even know what those things are. Sometimes you don't know what's important to a game until you change it, and that goes for both devs and communities alike. Remember that feeling we talked about earlier? It may be completely subconscious to a player, and while in their mind they may be thinking this feels like Call of Duty, or this feels like Halo or Battlefield, they may not be able to even identify the specific factors that are attributing to that feeling. It's a bit like that old saying, sometimes you don't miss something until it's gone. That's why none of this is as simple as it sounds. Even once you determine that going back to your roots could be a good idea, you still have to find new ways to innovate, then acknowledge that your formula is different from others, and then after all of that, you may not even be 100% sure about what those core principles even are. You still risk changing something that damages the experience for your players, and to end it, we need to address the biggest challenge of all. Because the same concept can mean different things to different games. But the same game can mean different things to different players. Even if you seemingly get all this perfect for one player, and they feel like the soul of the experience, the roots of the game are still intact, you successfully built cool ideas around it, and you've done a great job in their eyes, for someone else, you may not have. For someone else, the experience feels far too different still, and the changes don't work for them. I personally don't think Halo 5 feels like Halo, but I have spoken to fans who have been playing since the original back in 2001 who say they love Halo 5, and it feels like Halo to them. Who am I to tell them otherwise? When you enjoy something, you enjoy it. This entire concept is completely subjective. I've tried to make this video for months, and I just couldn't do it because for the longest time, I tried to make rules for what a game going back to its roots should do. And while I certainly think there are vague guidelines to follow, it is impossible to give a definitive answer on what should be done. How do you make a universal rule when, like this commentary hopefully illustrated, every game is so different? But on the flip side of that coin, saying games shouldn't go back to their roots, that's equally bad. The game being outdated isn't necessarily true either. Really, it just needs to be a feeling. If there is a common sentiment that a game has strayed from its roots, then it might be worth looking into what exactly has changed. Sometimes they are obvious traits, sometimes they are subtle, and it's up to developers to identify those principles. And it's also up to content creators to analyze the game, provide feedback, and so on. Ultimately, if a game has strayed away, do I think going back to your roots is a good idea? Yes. I think a game should always try to maintain its core principles and build around them. It's just not that easy. And games, even the ones that try to go back to what worked before, may not work for certain players. But even though it's a difficult thing to achieve, it's still worth trying. It's still something devs should attempt to do, because attempting to keep your core intact means keeping a game's identity intact. And that identity is what separates it from everybody else. And the more distinct each game is, and the more variety gamers have to choose from, the better our industry is as a whole. Till next time.